6 Reasons to Care About Inflation, part of our lecture series on inflation. In this video, we'll talk about the 6 reasons to care about inflation and why this is important. Inflation is important, even though inflation has been at a low and steady level for your, and actually for some of you, your parents' lifetimes in the developed world. So I'm going to lay out the 6 reasons briefly, and then I'm going to talk about each in a little more detail. So let me do the first 3 here. First of all, some inflation is important for the continuing, ongoing operation of the economy. Second of all, if there are unexpected changes, that can also harm the economy. Third of all, it makes it easier for any government, to pay its debts. Let me do the second half here. Fourth thing, if inflation gets out of control, then very bad things end up happening to our economy. The fifth one is that there's something about prices where some will adjust more slowly than others, and that's problematic. And finally, inflation and the rate of inflation creates winners and losers. And the good news is, if inflation is high, then you might be a winner, and I'll tell you why coming up. So here they are in more detail. First of all, low steady inflation keeps the economy going. Now, if inflation is occurring at 2% per year, and you are keeping money under your mattress, that means that that money, even though it's a store of value, is losing some of its value every year. So that money becomes worth less and less the more you put it under your mattress. Now, the US government, or any government, does not want you to put money under your mattress. They would much rather you put money in the bank, for reasons I will talk about in a future lecture, or invest it in someone's business, or buy something with that money. So this inflation rate allows an incentive for people to not hold on to their money, but to put their money to use, which helps the overall performance of the economy. So the key is that a low, steady rate of inflation allows you and allows companies and investors to let go of money into the economy. So that's the first reason that we care about inflation. The second reason is that if there are unexpected changes, those are worrisome. Individuals and businesses and investors can all plan if we have a steady inflation rate. But if there's a sudden change, it might make people too nervous to invest in speculative new ventures and more willing to hold on to their money and invest it in safer assets, or keep it safer and not move it around the economy the way we were talking about in the previous point. So a sudden change in inflation is problematic in this way, and we've seen this, although it's not primarily an inflation issue, but the pandemic, certainly the beginning of the pandemic, caused a lot of people to pull back their investments, pull back their hiring, and that actually did cause a little bit of deflation, which I'll get to in a future slide. Third reason is that it's easier for government to pay its debts if there is inflation. So for example, in 2016, the IRS withheld taxes, about $1.2 trillion worth, and then refunded about 20% of that back to consumers the following year. So that was only, we can think about that being sort of over at most like 16 months, most of the time much smaller than that. So due to inflation, when the government refunded that money was worth about $20 billion less. So the government was able to sort of put the money it withholds from income taxes to use, and then use that money later. When it paid it back, it was sort of worth less, and then the government is sort of more, can put that inflation that it's generating to use. And so $20 billion is real money, even though it's less than 0.5% of the government budget. It's still useful for the government to have this inflation and make it a little easier for it to pay its debts. Now, at higher levels of inflation, you can imagine that it makes it even easier for governments to pay its debts. And this has led to issues over, since we've had money, which, goes back to probably prehistory, but really the first coins were in the Roman Empire about 500 years before the Christian era. And so the tendency of governments when they get into debt is to increase the inflation rate to make it easier to pay off their debts, especially if they're in times of crisis. But there's a significant downside to this. If the government keeps doing this, inflation can get out of control. In other words, the government loses the ability to control its money supply and control the prices of goods because they have increased inflation too much. And this can lead to what we call hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is officially when the rate of inflation is 600% annually. In other words, when prices increase at 50% per month. So in other words, a car that cost $10,000 in June would cost $15,000 in July. And that's hyperinflation. And you can imagine that if you were saving up for a car, that's can be a huge problem. And hyperinflation really is a way to completely destroy an economy. Money becomes worthless, prices are constantly increasing, and economic productivity declines. What you would see in a period of hyperinflation is people would take their pay and immediately run to the store to try to buy goods because the goods won't lose their value the same way that money would lose its value. You can think about a store that's just sort of raising its prices, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. And this happens in a situation of hyperinflation. The highest ever recorded level of hyperinflation happened in Hungary after World War II. This bit of currency here is a 1 followed by 17 zeros. So it's a huge number, and that's a currency that was in use briefly in post-war Hungary because the price level just got completely out of control. You might think that that's 1947. That's a bunch of years ago, but actually Venezuela is going through a prolonged period of hyperinflation right now, and I'm going to click and get us over to a page on Wikipedia talking about it. And this is the official inflation rate that has been reported by Venezuela and through 2020. What you'll see is that the hyperinflation has really started in 2017, according to these figures, where in 2018, you can imagine the inflation percent went up by 130,000%. In other words, prices increased by 1,300 times. So in other words, something that cost $10 in January, the following January would have cost $13,000. So that's a very large rate of inflation. And we can still see that that Venezuela is still going through a hyperinflation period. These are one set of estimates. Wikipedia has a second set of estimates that go by year. And you can see that from these estimates, this started in October of 2017 and got to an amazing percentage through the winter of 2018. And again, is still at a very high percentage. They're still in this hyperinflation area. So what does a country do to fix inflation? What Venezuela is doing is what's called dollarization, where the government has actually said to its citizens that it might not want to use the Venezuelan currency. Their citizens might want to use US dollars because US dollars will keep their value more than the Venezuelan currency currently. Venezuela has tried to release new currencies, but these new currencies, again, quickly lose value and the hyperinflation persists. Either Venezuela will eventually switch over to an official dollar economy, or one day it will issue a currency that enough people believe in its stability that it will have its own stable currency going forward. The fifth reason to care about inflation is the differences in price adjustments. And I'd like you to think about this question and maybe participate in our Slack channel. And I'd like you to tell me which you think would adjust most quickly versus which you think would adjust most slowly. And I will show you, one is the prices at McDonald's or another fast food restaurant, the wages people get paid, the fares on a subway or public transportation system, a quantity tax, for example, a tax on cigarettes, and finally, credit card interest rates, the rates that you might be paying on your credit card, or you might know a family member who has a credit card and their credit card interest rates. So these are 5 options, and I'd like you to go to Slack and just give me your guess as to how quickly, what's the quickest one to adjust if there's a change in the price level, and what's the slowest one to adjust and change the price level. So the fact is, though, they all adjust at different times, and what we call that in economist terms, we call that price rigidity. If a price takes a long time to adjust, it's called a rigidity, and if we have an unexpected change in inflation, those rigidities can cause problems. You can imagine if, for instance, wages don't adjust as quickly as some other things, then everything for all the workers becomes more expensive, and that's, of course, very problematic. Finally, there are winners and losers with inflation. And to tell you this, I need to define some terms. So there are creditors. There are people or firms that loan money. For example, banks. Banks loan money. When you use a credit card, you're actually taking out a loan from a bank. Then there's also debtors or borrowers, and that's people or firms that borrow money. I have student loans. You may have student loans, so you're a borrower. And something we'll talk about when we get to talking about banking soon is that there's a thing in banking called maturity mismatch. In other words, banks tend to take in money that's payable very quickly, but banks tend to loan out money at a profit that's available very slowly. So this maturity mismatch leads to some winners and losers when it comes to inflation. So if inflation increases, in general, it makes it easier for debtors to pay off their debts. In that sense, government is no different than any other debtor, or I guess any other debtor is no different than the government, in that if inflation makes it easier for the government to pay off its debt, it also makes it easier for all the debtors in a country to pay off their debts. So if a person owes a lot of money, let's say in student loans, and the inflation rate ends up being higher than the interest rate, over time it makes it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to pay off that student loan. And in general, the people that make those loans end up getting less and less value for that loan that they issued when they get paid back. So in general, banks and other creditors tend to lose. So those are the winners and losers if inflation is increased. So student loans or fixed rate mortgages are situations where debtors could win. If the debtor has an adjustable rate that they're paying on their money, then this doesn't apply to them. So in summary, inflation is important to our daily lives, and understanding why it needs to be kept under control is also important. So these 6 reasons really show you how inflation really is important, even though it probably isn't something we focus on as much as we used to focus on it before the 1983 recession and the Great Moderation. Thank you.